We are accustomed to thinking of the United States as the gold standard of democracy, the shining city on a hill, the nation that defeated fascism, won the Cold War, and spent the better part of a century lecturing the rest of the world on the virtues of free elections and constitutional government. When Americans look at their country, they see a system that has endured for nearly 250 years without interruption. No military juntas, no dictators, no coups. Except that's not quite true. In the 20th century alone, the United States came within striking distance of dictatorship not once, not twice, but repeatedly. And the people planning these assaults on democracy weren't fringe lunatics or basement conspiracy theorists. They were generals decorated with the nation's highest honors. They were billionaires whose names adorned the buildings of Wall Street. They were intelligence agencies, operating with virtually no oversight, wielding powers that would have made the secret police of any authoritarian regime green with envy. This is the story of how American democracy almost died several times, and how, through a combination of institutional resilience, individual courage, and sometimes pure dumb luck, it survived. Some of these stories are well known. Others have been buried in classified documents for decades, emerging only when congressional investigations or Freedom of Information Act requests finally dragged them into the light. All of them should make you think twice the next time someone tells you that it cannot happen here, because it almost did. To understand what happened in 1933 and 1934, you have to understand how desperate and frightened America was. The Great Depression had been grinding on for 4 years. A quarter of the workforce was unemployed. Banks had failed by the thousands, wiping out the life savings of millions of ordinary people. Families were living in cardboard shacks they bitterly called Hoovervilles. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. Children were going hungry in the richest country on earth. Into this catastrophe stepped Franklin Delano Roosevelt, elected in a landslide in November 1932 on a promise to do something, anything, to fix the broken economy. And when he took office in March 1933, he began doing exactly that, with a speed and ambition that stunned the nation. The New Deal was not one program, but dozens. Banking reform, labor protections, public works, social security, regulation of Wall Street. In his first 100 days, Roosevelt pushed more legislation through Congress than most presidents manage in an entire term. Most Americans loved it. Roosevelt's approval ratings were astronomical. He was the man who had given the country hope again, who had told them in his inaugural address that the only thing they had to fear was fear itself. But not everyone was cheering. On Wall Street and in the boardrooms of America's largest corporations, there was something closer to panic. Roosevelt was regulating business. He was empowering labor unions. He was raising taxes on the wealthy. He was taking the country off the gold standard, which the financial elite considered practically sacrilege. Some of the richest and most powerful men in America looked at what was happening and saw not recovery, but revolution, a slow-motion socialist takeover of the United States, and some of them decided to do something about it. What happened next sounds like the plot of a bad political thriller, the kind of story you dismiss as too implausible for fiction. But it's real. It was investigated by a special committee of the United States Congress, and the documents are a matter of public record. In the summer of 1933, a group of wealthy businessmen and financiers began to formulate a plan to overthrow President Roosevelt. Not through an election. Roosevelt was far too popular for that. Through force. Or more precisely, through the threat of force, backed by the kind of money that could make threats very real. The plan, which would later become known as the business plot or the Wall Street putsch, was staggeringly ambitious. The conspirators intended to organize a massive army of veterans, 500,000 men by some accounts, and march them on Washington. This army would pressure Roosevelt to create a new cabinet position, a Secretary of General Affairs, who would effectively run the government. Roosevelt would remain as president, a figurehead, a puppet, while the real power would rest with this new position, controlled by the business elite. If Roosevelt refused, the army would simply remove him. The model was not American, it was European. In Italy, Mussolini had marched on Rome with his blackshirts in 1922 and seized power. In Germany, Hitler had become Chancellor in January 1933 and was rapidly consolidating control. The American plotters looked at these examples and saw not horror but inspiration. They saw that a determined minority, properly organized and financed, could seize control of a democratic government. And they had something that Mussolini and Hitler had initially lacked: unlimited money. The names allegedly involved read like a who's who of American capitalism. The DuPont family, owners of one of the largest chemical companies in the world, executives from General Motors, Goodyear, Bethlehem Steel, and other industrial giants. Members of the American Liberty League, a political organization dedicated to opposing the New Deal. J.P. Morgan and Company, the most powerful bank in America. They had the money. They had the connections. They had the motivation. What they needed was a leader, someone with military credentials, someone the veterans would follow, someone with enough stature to give the coup a veneer of legitimacy. They chose Major General Smedley Darlington Butler. It was the worst decision they ever made. You've probably never heard of Smedley Butler. That's a shame, because he may be one of the most important Americans of the 20th century. A man who, by simply refusing to do what powerful people wanted him to do, may have saved American democracy. Butler was, at the time, the most decorated Marine in American history. He had won the Medal of Honor twice, not the kind of medals you get for sitting behind a desk, but for extraordinary valor in combat in Haiti and Veracruz. He had fought in the Philippines, in China during the Boxer Rebellion, in Central America and the Caribbean. He was a fighting general, a soldier's soldier, gruff and profane and beloved by the enlisted men who had served under him. He was also, by the early 1930s, deeply disillusioned with the American military establishment and the corporate interests he had served. In 1935, he would publish a short book titled War is a Racket, in which he argued that most American wars were fought not for freedom or democracy, but for the profits of corporations. I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, he wrote. I helped make Mexico and especially Tampico safe for American oil interests. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the national city bank boys to collect revenues in. This was the man the conspirators approached. They assumed that a decorated military hero, recently retired and known for his outspoken views, would jump at the chance to lead a veterans' army against a president whose policies he might oppose. They were wrong about almost everything, but they were most wrong about Butler. The approach came through intermediaries, men like Gerald McGuire, a bond salesman connected to the financial elite, and Bill Doyle, a commander in the American Legion. Over a series of meetings in 1933 and 1934, they laid out the plan for Butler: organize the veterans, march on Washington, install a new regime. Butler listened. He asked questions, he gathered information, and then he did something that the conspirators never expected. He went public. In November 1934, Butler testified before the McCormack-Dickstein Committee, a special committee of the House of Representatives investigating un-American activities. He told them everything: the names, the plans, the money. He described in detail how he had been recruited, what he had been promised, what the plotters intended to do. The committee investigated. They found Butler's testimony credible. In their final report, they confirmed that certain persons made an attempt to establish a fascist organization in this country, and that attempts were made to establish a fascist organization to supersede the government by force. And then, almost nothing happened. No one was arrested. No one was prosecuted. No one went to jail. The major newspapers either ignored the story or mocked Butler. The New York Times dismissed his testimony as a gigantic hoax. Time magazine treated it as a joke. The wealthy men whose names had been mentioned issued indignant denials, and that was largely the end of it. The documents from the committee's investigation were partially suppressed. Some were not released for decades. The full extent of the conspiracy, who exactly was involved, how far the planning had progressed, how close the plotters came to actually executing their plan, remains unclear to this day. What we know for certain is this. In 1934, some of the wealthiest and most powerful men in America planned to overthrow the democratically elected President of the United States and replace him with a puppet controlled by corporate interests. The plan was modeled on fascist takeovers in Europe. It was stopped by one man, a retired Marine general who chose his country over his class, and America mostly forgot it ever happened. You don't need tanks in the streets to destroy a democracy. You don't need a dictator in a uniform, or soldiers seizing the radio stations, or political prisoners marching into camps. Sometimes all you need is fear. Fear is the most efficient tool of authoritarian control ever devised. A dictator who relies on force must maintain an army, a police state, a network of informers and enforcers, all of which costs money and creates enemies. But a dictator who can make people afraid, genuinely afraid, of some external or internal enemy achieves something far more economical. He makes people police themselves. They censor their own speech. They report their own neighbors. They voluntarily surrender the freedoms that would be too costly to take from them by force. In the late 1940s and 1950s, the United States experienced exactly this kind of fear, and it came terrifyingly close to a soft dictatorship that left the outward forms of democracy intact while hollowing out its substance. The catalyst was genuine. The Soviet Union had emerged from World War II as a nuclear-armed superpower with an explicitly hostile ideology. Communist spies had penetrated the American government and the Manhattan Project. This was real, not paranoia. The fall of China to communism in 1949, the Soviet nuclear test the same year, the Korean War in 1950, all of these created a genuine sense of existential threat. Into this atmosphere of fear stepped Joseph Raymond McCarthy, the junior senator from Wisconsin. McCarthy was, by most accounts, an unremarkable politician before 1950. A heavy drinker, a mediocre legislator, a man casting about for an issue that would save his floundering career. He found it on February 9, 1950, in a speech to a Republican women's club in Wheeling, West Virginia, when he held up a piece of paper and claimed to have a list of 205 known communists working in the State Department. He probably didn't have any such list. The number changed from speech to speech, 205, then 81, then 57, then other numbers. It didn't matter. What mattered was the claim, the performance, the theatre of outrage. McCarthy had stumbled onto a formula that would make him the most powerful and feared man in America for the next 4 years. The formula was simple. Accuse someone of being a communist. Demand they prove they weren't. When they couldn't prove a negative, because no one can prove a negative, point to their failure as evidence of guilt. Anyone who defended the accused was themselves suspect. Anyone who questioned McCarthy's methods was probably a communist sympathizer. It was a perfect closed loop, a Kafkaesque trap from which there was no escape. And it worked. For 4 years, McCarthy terrorized American public life. He held hearing after hearing, summoning witnesses before his Senate committee and subjecting them to hostile interrogation. Are you now, or have you ever been, a member of the Communist Party? The question became the most feared sentence in America. The casualties were enormous and mostly invisible. They weren't people who were shot or imprisoned, though some were imprisoned, and the Rosenbergs were executed. They were people whose lives were quietly destroyed. In Hollywood, the blacklist prevented hundreds of actors, writers, directors, and producers from working because of their alleged communist sympathies or associations. Some had indeed been communists. Many had simply attended a meeting, signed a petition, or had a friend who knew someone who once went to a rally. It didn't matter. The accusation was enough. Careers built over decades evaporated overnight. In the State Department, in universities, in school systems across the country. People were fired for their political beliefs, or for the political beliefs of their spouses, their friends, their relatives. Loyalty oaths were required. Background investigations were conducted. People were encouraged to inform on their colleagues, and many did. The climate of fear was pervasive. People stopped speaking freely at dinner parties, worrying that something they said might be reported. College professors avoided controversial topics. Writers self-censored. Artists retreated from political themes. The marketplace of ideas that is supposed to be the lifeblood of democracy was shuttered and padlocked. Freedom of speech didn't formally die during the McCarthy era. No law was passed abolishing the First Amendment. The Constitution remained unchanged, but freedom of speech effectively ceased to exist for millions of Americans because exercising that freedom could destroy your life. That's what a soft dictatorship looks like. The institutions survive, the forms are preserved, but the substance is gone. McCarthy eventually overreached. In 1954, he took on the United States Army, accusing it of harboring communists. The Army-McCarthy hearings were televised, and for the first time, a national audience saw McCarthy in action, the bullying, the lies, the cruelty. When Army Counsel Joseph Welch asked him, "Have you no sense of decency, sir, at long last? Have you left no sense of decency?" The spell was broken. The Senate censured McCarthy later that year. He died in 1957 of alcoholism at the age of 48, but the damage lingered. The blacklist continued into the 1960s. The culture of suspicion and conformity that McCarthyism had created didn't disappear with McCarthy himself. An entire generation of Americans had learned a lesson. Speaking your mind could be dangerous. That lesson took decades to unlearn, if it ever was. There's an old saying in political science: the fastest way to lose a democracy is to go to war. Not because war itself is undemocratic, but because war creates conditions under which democratic norms are suspended. Extraordinary powers are granted, and freedoms are curtailed. Always temporarily, always with the best of intentions, always with the promise that things will return to normal when the crisis passes. The thing is, crises have a way of not passing. And temporary powers have a way of becoming permanent. The 20th century was one long series of crises for the United States. 2 world wars, the Cold War, Korea, Vietnam, the War on Terror. Each crisis expanded presidential power. Each expansion proved difficult to reverse, and at certain moments, the accumulation of these powers brought the country to the edge of something that looked very much like autocracy. Franklin Roosevelt, the same president whose enemies had plotted to overthrow him in 1934, provides the first and most dramatic example. After Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt assumed wartime powers of extraordinary scope. He took control of the economy, directing what factories produced and at what prices. He imposed rationing on food, fuel, rubber, and dozens of other commodities. He created entirely new government agencies by executive order, without congressional authorization. And then there was Executive Order 9066. On February 19, 1942, Roosevelt signed an order authorizing the military to designate military areas from which any persons could be excluded. The order did not mention Japanese Americans by name. It didn't need to. Everyone understood what it meant. Within months, more than 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, the majority of them American citizens, many of them born in the United States, were rounded up, stripped of their property, and transported to what the government euphemistically called relocation centers, and what were, in plain language, concentration camps. They were held behind barbed wire, guarded by soldiers, for up to 4 years. No charges were filed. No trials were held. No evidence of disloyalty was required. The Supreme Court upheld the internment in Korematsu v. United States, one of the most infamous decisions in the court's history. It took the government more than 40 years to officially apologize and provide reparations to the surviving internees. This is what wartime power looks like when it encounters no meaningful resistance. A president signed an order. Citizens were imprisoned. The courts approved. Democracy continued to function, technically, for everyone else. But for 120,000 Americans, it had simply ceased to exist. If World War II created the precedent for expanded presidential power, the Cold War made it permanent. The logic was simple and, in its own way, compelling. The Soviet Union was an existential threat. Nuclear annihilation could come at any moment. There was no time for the slow deliberation of democratic governance. The president needed the authority to act quickly, secretly, and without the encumbrance of congressional debate. Out of this logic grew what the historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. called the imperial presidency, an executive branch that operated in matters of national security with virtually no checks or balances. The National Security Act of 1947 created the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Council, and the modern Department of Defense. Together, these institutions formed a national security apparatus of unprecedented power and secrecy. The CIA, in particular, operated in a twilight zone of legality, carrying out covert operations that were never disclosed to Congress, much less to the American public. What did the CIA do during the Cold War? The full list is still being compiled, as documents continue to be declassified decades later. But we know enough to draw a picture, and the picture is alarming. The CIA overthrew democratically elected governments, in Iran in 1953, in Guatemala in 1954, in Chile in 1973. It attempted to assassinate foreign leaders, including Fidel Castro, in a series of plots that ranged from the deadly serious to the bizarrely comic. Exploding cigars, poisoned wetsuits. It conducted mind control experiments on unwitting American citizens. The infamous MK Ultra program, which involved dosing people with LSD and other drugs without their knowledge or consent, sometimes with fatal results. It conducted mass surveillance of American citizens. Operation Chaos, launched in 1967, spied on anti-war protesters, civil rights activists, and other domestic groups that the government considered subversive. The CIA opened and read hundreds of thousands of pieces of mail sent to and from the Soviet Union and China. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, ran its own parallel surveillance operation, COINTELPRO, which infiltrated, disrupted, and destroyed domestic political organizations from the Black Panthers to the Women's movement to the anti-war left. None of this was authorized by Congress. Most of it was illegal under existing law. Much of it remained secret for decades, emerging only through congressional investigations in the 1970s, the Church Committee and the Pike Committee, that exposed the scope of the intelligence agency's abuses. The point is not that the United States became a dictatorship during the Cold War. It didn't. Elections continued. The press remained free. The courts functioned. But within the national security establishment, a parallel government had emerged, one that operated in secret, that was accountable to almost no one, and that routinely violated the rights of American citizens and the sovereignty of foreign nations. If the definition of democracy is government by the people, with the knowledge and consent of the governed, then this shadow government was profoundly undemocratic. And then came September 11th, 2001. The attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon killed nearly 3,000 people and traumatized the nation. In the atmosphere of fear and rage that followed, the United States embarked on an expansion of executive power that rivaled anything seen during the Cold War. The Patriot Act, passed just 45 days after the attacks with almost no debate, gave the government sweeping new surveillance powers. The NSA's warrantless wiretapping program, revealed by the New York Times in 2005, allowed the government to intercept the phone calls and emails of American citizens without court approval. The program had been operating in secret for years. The CIA established a network of secret prisons, black sites, in countries around the world, where suspected terrorists were held without charge and subjected to enhanced interrogation techniques that included waterboarding, sleep deprivation, stress positions, and other methods that international law defines as torture. The legal justification for these practices came from memos written by government lawyers who essentially argued that the president, as commander-in-chief, had the authority to authorize anything he deemed necessary for national security. Guantanamo Bay became a legal black hole, a place where people could be held indefinitely, without trial, without access to lawyers, outside the reach of American courts. Some detainees were held for more than a decade without ever being charged with a crime. In 2013, Edward Snowden revealed that the NSA had been collecting metadata on virtually every phone call made in the United States, as well as conducting mass surveillance of internet communications worldwide. The scale of the surveillance exceeded anything that had been publicly imagined. The government was watching its own citizens on a scale that would have been technologically impossible in the Cold War era. Once again, the United States did not become a dictatorship. Once again, the institutions of democracy continue to function, more or less. But the erosion of civil liberties was real and substantial, and much of it was accomplished in secret, without the knowledge or consent of the people whose freedoms were being curtailed. Let's address the elephant in the room. In recent years, the term deep state has become a partisan rallying cry, a catch-all accusation hurled at any government institution that displeases the accuser. Used this way, it's conspiracy theory, vague, unfalsifiable, and politically motivated. But strip away the partisan packaging and there is a serious question underneath. To what extent do unelected officials, in the intelligence agencies, the military, the permanent bureaucracy, exercise power that is not subject to democratic control? To what extent do they influence, constrain, or even override the decisions of elected officials? The answer, based on the historical record, is more than most Americans would like to believe. The most famous example is the relationship between President John F. Kennedy and the Central Intelligence Agency. Kennedy inherited the CIA's plan to invade Cuba using a force of Cuban exiles, what became the Bay of Pigs fiasco in April 1961. The invasion was a catastrophic failure, and Kennedy was furious. He felt the CIA had manipulated him, presenting the plan as virtually risk-free when it was anything but. He reportedly told advisors he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it into the winds. He fired Allen Dulles, the legendary CIA director, who had run the agency for nearly a decade. He appointed a new director, John McCone, and tried to bring the agency under tighter White House control. The CIA pushed back. Elements within the agency continued to pursue their own agenda, particularly regarding Cuba, where CIA officers maintained contacts with organized crime figures in ongoing plots to assassinate Fidel Castro, some of which may have continued without the president's explicit authorization. Then, on November 22, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Let me be clear, I am not going to tell you the CIA killed Kennedy. The evidence for that claim is inconclusive, contested, and buried under decades of conspiracy theorizing that has obscured more than it has revealed. The Warren Commission concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Many people dispute that conclusion. The debate continues. What is beyond dispute is that the intelligence agencies behaved in ways that undermined democratic accountability. The CIA withheld information from the Warren Commission. The FBI failed to share intelligence about Oswald's contacts. Documents related to the assassination were classified for decades. Some remain classified to this day, more than 60 years later. Whether or not the CIA was involved in Kennedy's death, the fact that a reasonable person could even entertain the possibility tells us something disturbing about the relationship between intelligence agencies and democratic governance in America. The Vietnam War provided another demonstration of how the national security establishment could operate independently of democratic control. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964, the event that gave President Lyndon Johnson the congressional authorization to escalate the war, was largely fabricated. The first attack on the USS Maddox was real, but was provoked by covert operations the administration had not disclosed to Congress. The second attack, which triggered the resolution, almost certainly never happened. Johnson and his advisors knew the evidence was shaky, but they used it anyway. Throughout the war, the military and intelligence agencies systematically misled the American public about the progress of the conflict. Body counts were inflated. Enemy strength was underestimated. The light at the end of the tunnel was always just around the corner. The Pentagon Papers leaked by Daniel Ellsberg in 1971 revealed the full extent of this deception. A systematic, decades-long campaign of lies designed to maintain public support for a war that the government's own analysts believed was unwinnable. This wasn't a coup. It wasn't a military junta, but it was a fundamental betrayal of democratic principles carried out by people who believed they knew better than the public, who believed that national security required the government to deceive its own citizens. One of the most insidious features of the national security state is its ability to classify information, to keep secrets not just from foreign enemies, but from the American people themselves. The MK-Ultra mind control experiments were conducted from the early 1950s through the late 1960s. They involved dosing unwitting subjects with LSD and other drugs, sensory deprivation, psychological torture, and other techniques designed to explore the possibilities of mind control. Some subjects suffered permanent psychological damage. At least one died. The program was not disclosed to Congress and was nearly completely destroyed when CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the files shredded in 1973. It was only discovered because a small number of financial records survived in a different filing system. Operation Northwoods, proposed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1962, outlined a plan to stage fake terrorist attacks on American soil, including sinking a boat full of Cuban refugees, staging bombings in Miami and Washington, and shooting down a civilian airliner as a pretext for invading Cuba. The plan was presented to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and rejected. It remained classified until 1997. These documents were classified not to protect national security, but to protect the government from its own citizens. The information they contained was not dangerous to the United States. It was dangerous to the people who had authorized the operations described in them. Classification was being used not as a shield against foreign enemies, but as a tool to prevent democratic accountability. How many other operations remain hidden? How many other documents are still classified, not because their contents threaten national security, but because their contents would threaten the reputations and legacies of the people who authorized them? We don't know. By definition, we can't know. And that uncertainty is itself a kind of damage to democracy. So here we are, at the end of this story, and the question that hangs over all of it is simple. Why? Why didn't the United States become a dictatorship? The opportunities were there. The plotters were real. The mechanisms were in place. At multiple points in the 20th century, American democracy was genuinely vulnerable. Why did it survive? The tempting answer is that Americans are special, that there's something in the national character, some deep commitment to freedom and self-governance that makes dictatorship impossible here. This is the myth of American exceptionalism, and like most myths, it's comforting and dangerous. The real answer is messier, more contingent, and far less reassuring. American democracy survived in part because of institutions. The separation of powers, the independent judiciary, the free press, the federal system with its divided authority, these structures created friction, made it harder for any one person or faction to seize total control. The business plot failed partly because the constitutional framework made it unclear how a corporate-backed dictatorship would actually work within the American system. McCarthyism eventually burned out partly because the Senate had the power to censure one of its own members. American democracy survived, in part, because of individuals. Smedley Butler refused to lead a fascist coup. Joseph Welch publicly shamed Joseph McCarthy. Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers. Edward Snowden revealed the NSA's surveillance programs. Mark Felt, the FBI's deputy director, fed information to Washington Post reporters about Watergate. At crucial moments, individuals chose to do what was right rather than what was expedient, often at great personal cost. And American democracy survived, in part, because of luck. The business plot conspirators chose the wrong general. McCarthy attacked the army, an institution with the power and prestige to fight back. Nixon's paranoia led him to create the evidence of his own crimes. Things could have gone differently. If Butler had said yes instead of no, if McCarthy had been smarter or more disciplined, if the Pentagon Papers had never been leaked. But here's the thing that should keep you up at night. None of these safeguards are permanent. Institutions can be weakened, they can be staffed with loyalists, they can be defunded, reorganized, or simply ignored. The norms that constrain power are exactly that. Norms, not laws of nature. They work only as long as people in power choose to respect them. Individuals can be silenced. Whistleblowers can be prosecuted, discredited, or driven into exile. The Espionage Act, originally passed in 1917, has been used with increasing frequency against government employees who reveal information the government would prefer to keep secret. The message is clear: speak up, and we will destroy you. And luck, by definition, cannot be relied upon. The history of the 20th century teaches us that the United States did not avoid dictatorship because Americans are inherently free or inherently virtuous. It avoided dictatorship because specific people made specific choices at specific moments, and because the institutional structures of the Republic created enough resistance to give those choices a chance to matter. But the same history teaches us something else: that the impulse toward authoritarianism is not foreign to America. It is not something that happens only in other countries, to other people, in other times. It is a permanent feature of political life, a constant temptation, a gravitational pull that operates on every society, including this one. The business plot showed that America's wealthiest citizens were willing to overthrow democracy to protect their wealth. McCarthyism showed that Americans would surrender their freedoms when they were sufficiently afraid. The Cold War showed that intelligence agencies would accumulate unchecked power whenever they were given the opportunity. The War on Terror showed that all of these lessons could be forgotten in the space of a single traumatic morning. Democracy is not a permanent condition. It is not a trophy that, once won, sits safely on a shelf forever. It is a practice, a daily choice, a set of commitments that must be renewed by each generation. It survives not because it is inevitable, but because people fight for it, sometimes loudly, in the streets and in the courts, and sometimes quietly, in the small decisions of conscience that determine whether a society remains free. The United States has come closer to losing its democracy than most Americans realize. The fact that it hasn't lost it yet is cause for gratitude, not complacency, because history doesn't promise happy endings. It only offers opportunities. What we do with those opportunities is up to us.